So the discussion panel is next, and it's going to be led by Dr. Anahita Faroudi Hafezi, a board member of Payvan Society. She is currently a sessional lecturer in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Saskatchewan. She holds a PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and an MPhil from the University of Oxford. With this, I will hand it over to her to run the discussion panel, but please, after the discussion panel, don't go anywhere. We have Yasaman, one of the main lead artists of this art show, to come and talk to us about that whole project. So without any further ado, Anahita Jun, thank you.
Thank you, Kati. I will get right to introducing our keynote speaker, who we are very honored to be able to welcome to join us today, Dr. Mona Tajali. Dr. Tajali is an associate professor of international relations and women's gender and sexuality studies at Agnes Scott College in Atlanta. Her research interests include women's political participation and representation in Muslim countries, with a comparative focus on Iran, Afghanistan, and Turkey, as well as institutionalization of women's rights in semi- or non-democratic contexts. She is the author of Women's Political Representation in Iran and Turkey, Demanding a Seat at the Table, and the co-author of Electoral Politics, Making Quotas Work for Women, both of which works were published as open access. A firm believer in engaging across the academic practitioner divide, Dr. Tajali has been a long-term collaborator with the Transnational Solidarity Network, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, and since 2019, she has served as a member of its executive board. Her work is published in both academic and popular outlets, including the Middle East Journal, Politics and Gender, The Conversation, and The Washington Post. And with that, I will invite her to begin her talk.
Hello. Greetings. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation. It is truly an honor to be among you virtually to mark this important day. I want to wish everyone happy International Women's Day. I truly wish I could have been among you in person. Because of circumstances beyond my control, that was not possible. I'm going to share my screen. I'm hoping that you are seeing the correct format. So yes, without further ado, I wanted to draw from my scholarship as well as my advocacy to speak about the history of feminist resistance in Iran, particularly within the past few years, and as well recognize its impact both domestically as well as regionally and as well globally. So I wanted us to maybe think about the Women Life Freedom protest as a watershed moment, and to what extent is it a very significant moment in Iranian political and social history. And to do that, I wanted to maybe touch on some of the key characteristics and significance of the protest from an intersectional feminist lens, one that I identify with, and as analyze its domestic, regional, and global impact with some very concrete examples of how this is being done. A lot of you know what sparked the recent protests. This was the tragic killing of Kurdish Iranian, 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian Mahsa Jina Amini in September 2022. When the protest erupted, many feminists, including myself, we were not necessarily surprised when we saw them erupt, and we were not necessarily surprised when we saw how expansive the protests became, particularly receiving global attention, because we knew they were a long time in the coming. And the main reason for that was because the protests were basically the result of decades-long systemic gender discrimination that at least half of the society felt as second-class citizens. And so that frustration and anger has definitely bottled up, that it was just looking for a spark to ignite it. And that spark was the tragic killing of Mahsa Jina Amini. Some of the key characteristics of the protest was that it was women-led. This was not the first time that we've had a mass protest and mass movement in Iran be women-led. I will talk about some other examples. However, it was the first time that the protests were intersectional. And what I mean by that, that this was the first time that we saw groups and individuals, regardless of gender, regardless of ethnicity, class, region of Iran, religious identity, age, they came together in a collective voice and expressed their frustrations from this state. And it was really an opportunity to have multiple historically marginalized voices to come together. The fact that Mahsa Jina Amini herself was a Kurdish Iranian, another historically marginalized population, that in itself really opened up the platform to have these marginalized voices to be able to speak. And it was very clear that the ultimate demand was radical change. It was anti-regime. No longer were the protests for reform. And the other characteristic was that the protests were leaderless. And that's, again, a very intentional strategy of the protesters, because they knew that they're facing a very violent state that could easily take out any leaders. And in fact, any efforts to be able to designate leaders for the protest, whether inside Iran or outside, have failed. So I did mention that these protests were a long time in the coming. Just within the past 45 years, we've had we've had a conservative gender ideology that dominated itself in Iran. Women composed very politicized and mobilized sections of their society in Iran. They participated in the Iranian Revolution in 79, 78. And as soon as the revolution succeeded and they saw that a theocracy was taking shape, women began to really become nervous. And in fact, exactly 45 years ago today, on March 8, 1979, we saw the first anti-theocracy protest. And that's when a lot of women poured into the streets of Tehran. And they basically demanded, and they said that this is not why we revolted, to see a reversal of our rights, including mandatory veiling. Unfortunately, at the time, many of the intellectual men, including leftist men, they were not ready to support women's cause. In fact, their rationale was that let's just wait until the revolution succeeds. Let's wait until democracy establishes itself, and then we'll address your rights. Obviously, that didn't happen. And we had for decades long extensive grassroots mobilization. We had in the 2000s, the 1 million signatures campaign. We had the Green Protest, which was another women-led protest. And of course, numerous instances of women peacefully, non-violently demanding voluntary veiling, such as the Daughters of the Revolution street. So this is an anti-regime protest of a frustrated public. This protest started by being in the streets. But because of very extensive crackdown from the state, they died down within their street presence, but they took different shapes. And I'm so glad that Roshijan was able to talk about some of the other forms of protest, particularly thanks to the use of social media that we were able to see. This is just a list of how we see the protests are continuing in multiple levels, multiple spheres. I would consider one of the most important ways that we see the protests are continuing is civil disobedience, where we still today see strikes, sit-ins being organized, whether on university campuses, whether at labor unions, and so on and so forth. But perhaps the most clear instance is appearing unveiled in the public, which is particularly being done by Iranian women and girls, despite knowing the risks, not just to their freedom, but to their lives. And I think that in itself is a really important aspect of seeing the protests continue, including political art. Most recently, we also saw that boycotting elections is another way of protest, where Iran had the historically low voter turnout for its parliamentary elections. So now moving on to basically the impact. So starting off with the domestic impact, the protests have clearly demonstrated that a social revolution has already taken place in Iran. What I mean by a social revolution is that already you have large sections of the society reaching that level of maturity that aspects of the society, such as gender equality, such as freedom of expression, freedom of religion, these are part and parcel of the larger demands for democracy, for human rights, for social justice. And this is a level, and that they need to unite together and that they need to stand together. This is a level of maturity that is very difficult to reverse, and hence I'm calling it a revolution. What is still pending is the political revolution, is where we actually see a shift in the formal political sphere. But that in itself is really important, significant achievement, and particularly because the youth have very much been at the forefront of this. Unfortunately, we also know that there's been extensive backlash against the protests, whether it's executions, whether it's mass arrests, or continued harassment and surveillance. To me, all of this also demonstrates the level of fear within the state. That if you have, composer of the song Baraye get prisoned not once but twice, this should tell you that how one song can shake the foundations of a decades-long state. So certainly there's a big gap between women's demands. As a scholar of gender and politics, I also wanted to highlight what just happened on March 1, which was the parliamentary election. So I've been covering women's electoral politics, women's demands to be more representative. And what we're seeing take place, another domestic impact, is that increasingly we're seeing a very unresponsive and unrepresentative government with greater control being given to the hardliners. And this was, many of us thought that maybe after Women Life Freedom protests, the regime might want to at least pay lip service to some of women's demands. But in fact, we're seeing that no, it's doing the exact opposite. It's actually trying to crack down even more. Some of the women who were just recently elected to the parliament have absolutely no connections to the feminist movement, are completely tone deaf to the Women Life Freedom demands. And as well, you see that there's bills in the parliament being discussed to actually increase surveillance, for instance, of improperly veiled women. Now moving on to the regional and the global impact. I think what's important to keep in mind with the Women Life Freedom protests is that the regional and the cross-border aspects of it is very much baked into its DNA. And I think what part of that, again, goes back to the fact that basically the martyr was Mahsa Jina Amini, a Kurdish Iranian woman. And in fact, the slogan of Jen Jian Azadi, which is Women Life Freedom, is a historical chant of the Kurdish women's rights movement with a very important history of resistance. I am a scholar also of Turkey. And for decades, when I was studying in Turkey and doing field research, I would hear Jen Jian Azadi being uttered in the streets of Istanbul and Ankara every time there was a women's march. It was really interesting to now see that slogan. Obviously, the first time it was uttered, it was at the funeral of Mahsa Jina Amini in her hometown, and then it spread very quickly to different parts of Tehran, and of course, it became the central slogan. So I think that in itself is a really important factor for us to keep in mind, that layers of layered forms of oppression finally were able to sort of come together in that regard. The other aspects of it is that it was asking for very fundamental universal demands. It was asking for the right to life, for the right to liberty, for the right to equality. These are, again, very basic progressive liberatory demands that connects people regardless of your geography, regardless of where you are. So you had a lot of feminists, particularly feminist women's rights groups, even young high school girls watching their social media in Morocco, in Beirut, in other parts, to really recognize and identify with this, because ultimately it was after that bodily autonomy. So we saw extensive global solidarity taking place. I think the symbolism of cutting hair, we had it, women MPs of the European Parliament did it, women all across the world did it. So this was really, really important. And many recognized that this was a protest that was not anti-Islam, but it was pro-equality and pro-freedom and, of course, bodily autonomy, something that is under attack everywhere, also in the United States, where I'm joining you from. Also, it was an instance of indigenous forms of feminism. By indigenous, I mean that regardless of the state Iranian state, trying to say that the high school girls who are protesting, they're actually influenced by the West, no one bought that. It was a completely grassroots-driven type of protest coming from within. And it was, again, because of that bottled up anger of decades of systemic oppression. To many of the observers in the region, particularly to our Arab neighbors, the protests helped highlight the extent of Iranian authoritarianism, particularly as they saw the crackdown, particularly as they saw even, high school girls being poisoned in their high schools with, the perpetrators just running free for months on end. And it also highlighted the extent of women's resilience and strength. And I think that was yet another really important aspect. And that's why the protest became really exemplary of other pro-democratic efforts in the region, particularly in the Arab Spring, the frustrations that lingered on post-Arab Spring, which we never saw in Arab Spring. But what was unique about it is that it was quite gendered, and it became very clear that gender and women's rights is very much integral to other protests. Of course, other aspects is that we saw the transnational advocacy. This was unprecedented show of solidarity and organizing by Iranians abroad. That we had never seen before. I mean, Iranians inside Iran had been protesting the Islamic regime for numerous occasions, but this was the first time that you saw Iranians abroad really look at this as an opportunity that they also want to join in, despite also recognizing the costs to themselves, recognizing that maybe it would prevent them from being able to travel back to Iran and so on and so forth. So you had in Berlin up to 80,000 individuals participated, Toronto 50,000 individuals participated. So now with regards to transnational feminist advocacy and drawing from my own advocacy and what that has meant in terms of the larger feminist movement, I'm part of the transnational feminist solidarity network called Women Living Muslim Laws that actually dates to the 1980s. It was actually created when you saw political Islam and religious fundamentalism rise, not just in Iran, but in other parts of the region, and women's rights were being reversed one by one in the name of Islam, in the name of conservatism. And one of the projects of Women Living Under Muslim Laws has been feminist constitutionalism. So one thing that many of us feminists, many of us Iranian feminists, but as well, both, particularly in the diaspora, but also with some within Iran, we wanted to see what will women-led freedom look like in practice. Let's look at this as an opportunity that we need to really dig deeper into. So this is where we saw a lot of feminist groups come and do really important radical, what I call homework, to be prepared for that eventual radical change. For instance, we saw feminist groups in December of 2022 for the first time publish an LGBTQ manifesto in Persian. This was, again, completely an organic matter. This was a really important move because it was able to really break the taboo on being able to talk about gender rights and sexual orientation and so on and so forth. The project that I particularly became involved in was actually arriving at an Iran Women Bill of Rights, and that's our website there. It's iwbr.org, and basically this is a document that about more than a dozen of feminists of Iran, most of them in the diaspora, we came together and we recognized, what does absolute gender equality mean? And if the time comes, which we know that's going to come, we just don't know exactly when the time comes to actually rewrite the Iranian constitution, what should be some of the key demands of women? So what do we mean when we say absolute gender equality with the right to education, with the right to employment, women's right to travel, women's bodily autonomy, women's political participation and representation, women's judgeship, and so on and so forth. So the bill is actually 20 articles, and we decided to call it a Bill of Rights versus a Charter of Rights. I think some of the Canadians might appreciate this because of the fact that we wanted to make it be as legally ready for it to be quickly integrated into the Constitution of Iran, drawing from international human rights documents. The other example is, of course, paving the way for global action on gender apartheid. Because of systemic gender discrimination has been occurring globally, but we have Iran and Afghanistan currently really standing out from all the other countries in terms of that gender apartheid. So we had feminists and legal advocates that have been demanding the recognition of gender apartheid as an internationally recognized crime against humanity, very similar to how racial apartheid has been recognized in international law, thanks to South Africa's efforts. Gender apartheid has not been recognized. The campaign for this started by Women Living Under Muslim Laws and a few others back in the 1980s, but the international community was not at all receptive to this until the past few years. So for the first time, we're seeing a joint effort of Afghan and Iranian women on gender apartheid. In fact, just last Thursday, MP Essasi, a Canadian parliamentarian, actually received the petition on behalf of some Iranian and Afghan women to go ahead and ask Canada to pressure the United Nations to finally recognize gender apartheid as well as a crime against humanity. And of course, Narges Mohammadi, Shirin Ebadi, the Nobel laureates have also publicly declared that the time has come to recognize this. So in conclusion, I think it's important to keep in mind that Iranian women's efforts have been a source of inspiration for the region as well as the globe. Obviously, the fact that Iran has had two women Nobel Peace Prize laureates in the past 20 years, that in itself is a really important milestone. This is despite the crackdown that we're seeing take place. And unfortunately, the international community, there's a lot of other problems like geopolitical issues, like the fact that Iran is continuously backed by Russia and China. There's a lot of different obstacles, but there's more that needs to be done, particularly collectively with those of us inside and outside. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much for that. I believe, Kati, we will wait until the end of the panel for questions. If that's okay with Dr. Tajali, are you able to stay until the end of the panel?
Yes, certainly.
Okay. So thanks again, and